It's Saturday, the 11th of September. You're watching The Quest with me, Addiel Sabir. Well, I actually had prepared quite a lengthy introduction and monologue, but I think I'll save that because the news wheel is being dominated by the anniversary, the 20th anniversary of the September the 11th attacks. Of course, those attacks which shook the world, forever etched in people's minds. Some 3,000 people were lost in those attacks carried out allegedly by the Al-Qaeda leadership, which was holed up in Afghanistan. Now, what ensued was Operation Enduring Freedom, that was launched by George W. Bush. And since, what we have seen is that approximately 2 weeks ago, the Afghan Taliban have moved into power following the US withdrawal. Now, to help us reflect on what has happened over the last 20 years or so, we're joined by a panel of guests. First, let me introduce Lieutenant General retired Naeem Khalidi, who is a defense analyst. Thank you for joining us. Moyed Jafri, who's a senior journalist and also a political analyst. Thank you, Moyed, for joining us. And Asif Durrani, who is a former ambassador and also now a political analyst. I just want to begin, gentlemen, by saying if we could just try to keep the answers as brief as possible so that we can skirt through quite a lot of what needs to be discussed. Of course, we could do almost a week's worth of programs perhaps on this. But let me begin with you, General Lodi. The American exit, described as a chaotic exit. We saw some of the scenes at Kabul airport. We saw the devastation caused by a terrorist attack which was carried out by ISIS. Just very, very briefly, General Lodi, one lesson that you can take away from this whole 20-year debacle?
First of all, just I'll say a word about the exit. Exits are always like this, and exits are normally, you cannot exit a country after 20 years in a very peaceful and calm manner. That is how it is. In my opinion, the 20 years, as long as Americans were here, this part of the world, Central Asia and West Asia and South Asia, I think it went through hell. And especially Afghanistan and Pakistan bore the main brunt of what all was going on. A lot of blood was shed, and there was a lot of break in the society, and any social problems and economic problems and political problems, anything one can think of, it did happen. So we went through, you can say, a sea of blood during these 20 years. And I was always of the view that the first condition for bringing peace in this region is the exit of foreign forces from Afghanistan. And that has happened. I don't say that, future will be all goody-goody and we will, we will be having a lot of Bollywood time, not immediately. But the first step has been taken. The things are moving in the right direction. And if, I think, conducted properly by the leaders of this region, I see a more prosperous region, a more connected region, and a better life for the lot of people over here.
Indeed, I mean, that is the sentiments of most of Afghanistan's neighbours, one would assume, especially Pakistan, who has a very vested interest sharing the border. And of course, what we have seen over the last decade or so is the devastation caused as a result of spillover terrorism into Pakistan. Mr. Durrani, the single biggest lesson from the United States, given the fact that they've got the largest number of graduates, postgraduates, PhD holders, think tanks, intelligentsia, where did it all go wrong for the Americans? The biggest lesson?
I think the military adventurism was the biggest lesson, should be a biggest lesson for the Americans, that none of the wars which they undertook since Vietnam, they have not won. And secondly, the biggest lesson should be that don't be arrogant, because it was American arrogance in Afghanistan which brought the situation to this pass, and it became America's longest war in its history, because Taliban were ready to surrender and sign the document in 2002. And President Karzai had tried to mediate, but Defense Secretary Rumsfeld summarily dismissed it. and he thought that we can do without the Taliban. And probably this should also serve as a lesson that when you are an occupation force, don't be so arrogant that you forget that those who have become vanquished, they can rise again. And this is what precisely has happened in Afghanistan, that Taliban, after being vanquished, rose again, and now they are ruling again. Yes.
Moyed, just want to bring you into the conversation vis-a-vis what we were expecting today. We were expecting some form of formal oath-taking ceremony. That apparently now has been postponed. Of course, the optics, some would suggest, would not have been particularly the right time and the right place for the Afghan Taliban to have unveiled, well, they already have unveiled their interim government, but to actually hold an oath-taking ceremony on this particular day would have been tantamount to rubbing the mud into the American noses. Would you agree?
Totally. I believe it was a sane decision not to go ahead with this oath-taking ceremony. The world can have all the conversation regarding truths surrounding 9/11, but the bigger truth is that more than 3,000 people lost their lives, no matter what happened. And it would have been in very poor taste if something like the beginning of a government was, marked on this particular day, especially considering the fact that the Americans and the Taliban were arch enemies. Definitely not how it appears today, obviously, but it was the right decision to make. And it would have set the course of the Afghan government and the world as a whole going into the future on the wrong foot. So I agree with you on this, and I agree with the Taliban, and especially the way Russia weighed in and talked some sense into it, into the Taliban, as we now know through the words of Russian diplomats. So yes, I agree that it was the right thing to do. Not to rub salt into the wounds of the United States and take steps that would move towards more of an understanding towards peace among all the stakeholders in Afghanistan.
Now, 20 years have elapsed, and of course, in this course of 20 years, we've heard so many conspiracy theories surface. And what we have seen recently is that Joe Biden has decided to declassify the 9/11 documents. My question to you, General Lodi, what purpose would that serve, do you think, by Joe Biden making these classified documents declassified now, if any?
I think one is that it is normal with the American government that they do declassify the documents after 30 to 50 years. So this has been done a little earlier, I would say 5 to 10 years earlier. But I think it will lay to rest all these theories which you are talking about, conspiracy theories. No, it was not like this, and the buildings were demolished. So people had a lot of, because those who were, bringing these theories forward, they were giving a lot of arguments to actually prove whatever they were saying. But I think once these documents come up, which I have not gone through, one must go through them and read everything. But then we should also remember that great empires can have layers and layers of, secrecy. So I will just take it with a pinch of salt. Whatever has been made public, we need to use our own analysis and ability to, find out the truth, which becomes very difficult in these cases. So the main purpose is to lay to rest these conspiracy theories and to prove to the world that they were right in attacking Afghanistan, and they were right in staying there for such a long time. Let us see how will they, attacking Afghan government at that time was probably could be justified as the whole world was, with them. But staying there after, they had achieved their objective in 2 years, decimating the Al-Qaeda. But why were they here for the remaining 18 years? That once we go through the documents and we will go through more analysis later on, we would come to know.
And that too will probably fall into the ambit of conspiracy theories as to why the prolonged stay of the Americans in Afghanistan. Ambassador Durrani, talking about optics, perhaps this was Joe Biden's perhaps biggest achievement had he been successful in withdrawing the US troops and withdrawing the US troops with their allies out of Afghanistan without any bloodshed. Unfortunately, he's now under the cosh, under the microscope, at home for the chaotic withdrawal. Biden also perhaps wanted to take ownership of today's ceremony. So just from a diplomatic point of view, the optics are going to be slightly different on this anniversary for Joe Biden. Your take?
Yeah, I think now, but on the 20th anniversary has also become a slinging match between the Democrats and Republicans. And otherwise, if you look at the Taliban-US agreement, actually it was signed by President Trump's administration and endorsed by Joe Biden, who in any case was averse to having American troops inside Afghanistan. He was rather more, in fact, inclined to have over-the-horizon operations against so-called terrorists. So here I think he is following his policy, and his doctrine is that they will not go and they will not send boots on the ground, but they are going to have counter-terrorist operations through the air, although there could be argument that this is a flawed policy. But at the same time, as you referred to about his disclosure of certain documents, again, it is a domestic politics in the United States, and he may have many such documents where it would prove that the Republican decision going to Afghanistan, or especially going to Iraq, was flawed, and they couldn't find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. But they were adamant to go to Iraq, and within 14 months of their occupation of Afghanistan, President Bush Jr., in fact, he straight away went to Iraq. And I was in the United Nations in New York when General Colin Powell, as Secretary of State, displayed that vial and saying that this is the weapon of mass destruction, alluding to a vial in which he had some biological weapon. But those they couldn't find. And now it has become so clear, especially after the Chalcott investigation report in the United Kingdom, that was all a sham. In fact, security intelligence assessments were portrayed as policies of and as a proof of Iraq possessing weapons of mass destruction. So it is just not Afghanistan. Yeah, although the attack was on Afghanistan, still we normally forget in our debates about what action the United States took against Iraq, and subsequently it turned out to be a movement against the Arab states, and then they wanted to bring in democracies in those countries, and now you have seen how we are looking at Syria, at Libya, in Tunisia, in Egypt, and then even the Gulf states, which are monarchies, apparently they are quiet and they are peaceful, but they are in a state of flux, and they are facing much more serious issues in the region, including Iran. So these are the things which have created, and the 9/11 actually became the trigger, and now we are facing the music. And especially Pakistan has also been affected badly during all these 20 years. Yes.
I mean, we will come to the effects or the regions Pakistan faced. Moeed, I mean, as Ambassador Durrani has pointed out, the 9/11 attacks were the sort of like precursor to the Americans' involvement in Iraq, and perhaps in Syria, other places within the Arab world. Then we saw the Arab Spring. But what it did actually do, perhaps, was throw up more words into our vocabulary, the ordinary person's vocabulary for that matter. The word Islamophobia first surfaced possibly a number of years after that. And then we've brought in other words into the vocabulary which people weren't aware of. Al-Qaeda perhaps was one word that nobody was aware of. This group, Osama bin Laden, became a household name. The war on terror was a term which was openly used, and it was countered with the so-called war on terror. Daisy cutters, Dora Bora, etc., etc., etc. So how, Moeed, do you feel that The intervention in 2001 into Afghanistan, which led to a number of incursions by the Americans elsewhere, has contributed to the one most singular word which is now reverberating around the world, Islamophobia.
It's basically, Adil, it's changed the outlook of the entire world, not just the United States, not just Iraq, Afghanistan, or other countries which were directly invaded by the United States. From the advent of the Patriot Act that was brought in by President Bush, we saw this hysteria created by the American media. We saw how the American think tanks, how the American brains, they faltered badly. We very distinctly remember how Mr. Wali Nasser, who was at that point of time their specialist for Middle East and Southeast Asia, he faltered when he talked about how Sunnis and Shias have no history of violent clashes and they can coexist. We saw how John McCain came forward with false theories. And this entire thing spun out of control, where we saw attacks not just on Muslims, but we saw attacks on people who look like Muslims, not just in the United States, but across Europe. We saw Gitmo, how people were treated there. We saw Abu Ghraib, and all these things, they came into the world was one way before 9/11, and it is now another way. And an Islamophobic sentiment, as you said, the word came to light after that. It's going strong. It's not like it has diminished. It's not like people have stopped hating Muslims, for that matter. We still see the Republican side of the United States calling extremism not just religious extremism or just extremism or terrorism as it is, but tagging it as Islamic radical extremism and just putting that word in there because everybody, as we all know, that normal people, they do not go into the philosophical dimensions and intricacies of all this. We see how the rise of Islamophobia in Europe, in Italy, in France, for that matter, it's still a big problem. And the worst part of this was this doctrine of preemptive strikes that came out of the 9/11, in the aftermath of 9/11, as Ambassador Durrani rightly pointed out about the preemptive strikes on Iraq. And now countries who are known to have terrorist tendencies themselves, like for that matter, India, they've been very clear. The Indian government has been saying this more than once, that because America had the right to act preemptively and attack other countries because it felt threatened. And it believed, because if you remember correctly, the United Nations was not very sure to sanction America's war preemptive strike into Iran, but America did it anyway. So India has said now more than a couple of times that it has the right to preemptive strikes as well if it feels it would be threatened by an attack in the future. So this entire paradigm of hatred towards one religion, the way American media portrayed it, the way the Western media portrayed it, Sikhs were under attack because they look like Muslims. So we're still living in a world that is becoming increasingly Islamophobic. Attacks on Muslims haven't stopped. And we are, Pakistan's Prime Minister, President of Turkey, Muslim leaders have been trying to highlight this issue and trying hard that the West does not just brush it under the carpet saying, oh, that ship has sailed, because it has not.
Before we head into the break, I just want to quickly bring in General Lodi for your very comments on what, just a follow on from what Moeed is saying. Of course, the polarization of the world. On the one side, you have the rise of Islamophobia, and on the other side, you have almost like a strengthening, almost a resilience against the nefarious designs as described by some of these Islamic groups that we're seeing. And one of the products, or one of the byproducts, despite the existence of Al-Qaeda for some 33 years, has been the likes of these so-called Islamic State. So is it a question of nullifying one alleged monster and giving birth to another, or were they both, in fact, products of the Americans in the very first place?
I think Jafri Saab has put it quite aptly, and if you look at the results of this action of 9/11, which I would say a reaction it has actually affected the entire Islamic world. It has affected the world at large. There's no doubt about it, as Durrani Sahab was saying, as Jafri Sahab was saying. But it has specifically affected the Islamic world, and not only Islamophobia. Actually, physically, many countries have been destroyed, like Syria, like Yemen, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and Pakistan also paid a very high price. So, this Arab Spring phenomena also erupted within this period. So we have to ponder on it, whether it was all by chance or it was some well-planned arrangement. So it cannot be by chance that most of the most affected countries are all Muslims, and they have been physically affected, they have been psychologically affected, and Islamophobia has taken roots and all that. So probably the philosophers of Islamic world must sit down and try to make that what actually was the purpose of all this, and whether that purpose has been achieved or it has proved counterproductive or whatever it is. But what I see today is that Islamic world 20 years back, once Gaddafi was there, Saddam was there, probably was doing much better as compared what is happening today. So probably we need to think. I will not give a verdict, but I think this thing requires some brain searching and head scratching, that what was the actual purpose of all this.
Indeed. Now we're going to take a short break. Coming up on the other side, we will discuss, General Lodi has pointed out, was it all worth it? Was this intervention of 20 years, which cost thousands of lives, not only American and Allied lives, but also those thousands and thousands of Afghans and those across the border in Pakistan who lost their lives as a result of that protracted 20-year war? All of that and a bit more coming up after this break. Do stay with us. Welcome back to The Quest. So we are discussing the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks, 2001, and the legacy it leaves behind and what of the future. Just before the break, we were talking about, was it worth it? Was it all worth it? Human life, the tragedy of human life is one of the components of a war, and there are no real winners or losers. Or are there? Let me just put this quick question to, let me begin by asking Ambassador Durrani. Ambassador Durrani, winners and losers. One winner, clearly, in all of this, and there should be no winners, are, for example, the American arms suppliers, the American contractors, the security companies operating, even perhaps pharma. So what of these winners, or these so-called winners that we talk about, particularly that we all know that arms supply is a big business?
Yes, you're right, Adil. I think the biggest winners are the military-industrial complex, and which is no more a secret. Everyone knows it. Since 9/11 onwards, Afghanistan and Iraq took up the largest chunk of money. Overall, it was $6 trillion, but Iraq and Afghanistan together are $5 trillion, which has gone to military-industrial complex and its allied interest groups. They are there. Even they have said that journals and retired politicians, they have been on the boards and they have been the beneficiaries. I don't know what kind of investigations could be launched on that. And then what we have to look at is the amount of devastation and destruction which now we have witnessed. Forget about Afghanistan or Iraq, which are the direct affectees. Pakistan, when you say with the 80,000 people dead, including 8,000 are law enforcement agencies, if that's the case, then we didn't lose that big number of our human resource, even with 3 wars, during 3 wars in India. So you can imagine the amount of sufferings now Pakistan have had to face. And secondly, in terms of opportunity cost, Now the figures is close to $150 billion. So that was there. And the third thing, very important thing, which we normally have not discussed is that the travel advisory itself were kind of sanctions against Pakistan, which otherwise we have ignored, because we were the non-NATO allies, but at the same time, the advisories were there. It means they did not allow the people to travel to Pakistan, mostly the businesses. And that's how your exports are not going on. One of the major factors is this, but when these countries, whether Americans and others, they themselves wanted to come to Pakistan, so for them, then the advisory would not act. So this was a deliberate attempt to put Pakistan under pressure. I'm only focusing on this because of the devastation which has taken place. Beneficiaries were there, and those were the American beneficiaries, and that too the military-industrial complex. So here, these are the complex gains, and now they think that there will be certain disclosures. And I see the President Biden's announcement about disclosing those files in that light, because rather than some other intelligence sources or journalists, they disclose that, it's better that they should read, because it's going to give them political benefit to Mr. Biden for his second term. Yes.
Very much so. I mean, Moyed, I just want to ask you about this notion of hearts and minds. Another a term which was coined following 2001 about not only just the Afghan war but other wars as well. It's surfaced quite a lot. Winning hearts and minds. You win it on the battlefield. You win hearts and minds of the population which you are suppressing in many ways. The American exit, if I just want to play devil's advocate, perhaps, if it can be conceived like that, has been perhaps a bit of a loss for the Afghan people. We have seen post-2001 a number of infrastructure projects. I believe just the supply of electricity back in 2001 and to current day, I think all of Afghanistan is pretty much electricity efficient now. And not of course, forgetting the education system, particularly children and particularly girls, and the economy as well, which had been somewhat stabilized. So would you deem these as losses, or would you deem these as gains which were made but now will maybe transform into losses if we see chaos and anarchy in Afghanistan?
It's a very complicated question and has an even more complicated answer. Addiel, we've seen how the entire doctrine of create chaos, end chaos, declare great victory by the United States and all these countries that it has invaded has not really panned out well. We talk about Afghanistan. America just couldn't come across or come out as the great savior in the end, even after getting out thousands and thousands of people from Afghanistan out of the Kabul airport because they wanted to leave. Eventually, what would define the situation? This doctrine of winning the hearts and minds of the locals, planting the seeds of democracy, these cliches that the American Congress or American diplomats have been using for decades now. But we have to look at the success rates of it. We have to see how they panned out in the end. The Iraqis still hate the Americans. That's why they've announced they're going to leave Iraq by the end of this year. You talk about Egypt, even after Mohammed Morsi's death, the recent uprisings there, not really in favor of the Americans, no matter what they've done. And similarly in Afghanistan, apparently they built infrastructure, they started schools, but the world would need to understand and come to terms with the cultural identities and the way people in a certain geographical or topographical area live their lives. And that one size fits all cannot be implemented on everyone to make them happy. It takes years and years of studying and understanding and analytics to first of all mesh what you want to do with the cultural fabric of that country. So that's being said, The situation in Afghanistan right now, as we see, the majority of Afghans are still not happy with the Americans, in spite of them claiming that they spent thousands and thousands of American lives and trillions of American dollars to do so. So I believe the Americans will need to, or anyone for that matter, who has such aspirations, will need to understand that this will not win war, terror, death, suffering, will not win the hearts and minds of any locals, be it Afghans, be it Iraqis, or any other nationality.
The spare of thought, I think, perhaps for that generation which grew up in 2001, an entire generation almost, 20 years, you would have the youth who are somewhat confused, perhaps, as to the lives that they were leading, particularly those in urban centres, particularly those in Kabul. So they're looking for opportunities elsewhere. Some say there was going to be a huge influx of refugees pouring into Pakistan. So far, so good and contained, I believe, similarly with Iran as well. But talking about the neighbours, General Lodi, we see now a new bloc appearing, or as commentators would say, a new bloc is appearing with the new world order in this particular region. Tell us of what you've been hearing. There are some reports suggesting that perhaps there was some meeting which took place in Islamabad's capital today, a huddle, if you may, of the key players in and around the region.
Yes, I've heard about it, that on the invitation of our ISA chief, the intelligence chiefs of all the neighboring countries, they were here. It has been revealed just a few hours back. So which means that if the China was there, Iran, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Pakistan, Uzbekistan. So this is the, I think, things going in the right direction. This is the region which actually needs to put all their energies to make sure that Afghanistan remains on track, and in Afghanistan they create an environment where economic activity can take place, where connectivity can take place, and it will be good for all the neighbors. Not only neighbors, I think even the farther countries also, because everything will flow to Indian Ocean and then from beyond to Middle East and even to Africa. So the landlocked group of these Central Asian countries and the access of Russians to warm waters and Chinese BRI, taking up more rapidly, and our own CPEC is likely to, get faster if all this goes in properly. I would only like to add that yes, whereas Americans, they did not succeed in winning the hearts and minds of Afghans, but whatever they have built, it will not go waste, because the bridges are intact, the roads are intact, even the electricity which you were talking about, nobody would like to harm the power producing companies, or even the universities which have been made by various countries, donated, those will be there. And this is, I think, the fruit of the way Taliban got control of the country without any bloodshed, without a lot of fighting, which will make sure that the entire infrastructure remains intact. So if that happens, and if there's no further civil war, which we are not expecting, no further infighting, of course some small skirmishes may continue. So we do believe that this portion of the world is going for better times, economically and politically, and maybe will be better connected. The only wild card being India, because we'll have to see in future whether India aligns itself with the events which are happening here, so that to benefit themselves also, because a lot of economic activity will also give them a great chance. They are a big country to actually latch on this opportunity and work with others, or they keep treading the course which they are doing today, which probably is counterproductive, not only for India herself, but also for American, their deep allies for the time being, and the public will suffer. So I think Pakistan and all these regional countries should invite India once again, that let us work for peace. And China can also ask them once again that they can join CPEC. The only small proviso is that they will have to stop the atrocities in Kashmir. We are not saying that resolve the Kashmir problem and then come to CPEC. Just stop the atrocities, have some normalcy, and then we can start talking and we can start operating in the economic field and political field. That would be a, I think, great thing if it happens. Otherwise, all other things are going in the right direction.
And staying with that, Ambassador Durrani, the rebuilding of the cradle of civilization, this area known as the cradle of civilization, much will depend on the Taliban 2.0 and obviously how it reacts with the rest of the world, how it interacts with the rest of the world. And as General Lodi has pointed out, there is one wild card. Wild would probably be a softer word that is used by General Lodi. But of China, of India, the nexus that we are seeing develop in this region, how critical and important is it either to bring India on board or then to isolate India if it continues with its approach of trying to make Pakistan a plausible explanation for everything that's wrong in the region?
I think India has played the spoiler's role during the past 2 decades. Even earlier also, they were part of the nexus, which was Iran, Russia, and India. They were supporting the erstwhile Northern Alliance. But now it is a situation which is, quite contrary to what Indians were trying to do in Afghanistan. But having said that, I think diplomatically, India would also not want to be isolated. And that's why now they are looking for avenues to come closer to the Taliban, have dialogue with them. Which is why now, if you look at it, that what happened in Panjshir or elsewhere, so on Panjshir, their reaction was mute officially. Otherwise, commentaries are there, commentaries abound, and they talk, different. Even they accuse Pakistan of helping that. But, you can laugh it off. What India will have to do is, and is likely to do, is that they will not put all their eggs into the American basket and be part of the Quad. And already Indians have said that they will not participate in Quad as a military alliance, and that is there. But in the region, they cannot afford two-front situation. On one hand, we have China, and then with Pakistan, and be isolated with the entire Central Asian region. And on the other hand, all immediate neighbors of Afghanistan are on one page. Like General Sabir has said that there was a meeting today of the intelligence chiefs of all the immediate neighbors of Afghanistan. If that's the case, then Indians might be very much concerned, and they would want to find a way to be part of the equation. And this would be a win-win situation for them, and in no way they cannot remain isolated from Central Asia, Russia, or China, for that matter, or even Pakistan, or for that matter, Iran. So, and they'll have to, and so they are actually in a dire strait as far as this emerging situation is concerned. But we should, I think, diplomacy also demands that we should show flexibility as far as opening up routes are concerned, because ultimately it is going to benefit all the countries of the region, which will be accessible to each other, and if they have better connectivity. So I think in that case, I can go on, but briefly I want to say this, that I think if Indians show their inclination to be part of the CPAC, so I think we should welcome them because it is a win-win situation for everyone, yes.
Peace, prosperity, integrity, trust, these are all factors surrounding this particular region. And I just want to have the last words from Moeed Jafri. Of course, Pakistan, always under the microscope, whether it does right or wrong internationally. It's been tried to be declared as a pariah state. India, hell-bent. If you just have to read some of their headlines from some of their morning dailies, quite shocking, in fact. But, however, let's not forget that the American blueprint is not going to go away. With trillions and trillions of dollars which have been invested in the region, they still have, or they will have, the intelligence network, their network of espionage. They will still, perhaps, still use drone strikes. So, of Pakistan, now Pakistan has a completely different position as a regional player. Your final concluding remarks, Moeed, vis-a-vis Pakistan, where Pakistan stands now, and what are the challenges, the main principal diplomatic challenges that lie ahead for Pakistan?
We need to understand one thing very clearly. Before this, we used to talk about it as conspiracy theories, but there have been sane voices coming outside from within the United States. We all know that the U.S. spends more on defense than the next 20 odd countries combined, 18 of which are its allies. So when you have something in such massive supply, then you ought to create a demand for its use, which is where now we've seen how the Pentagon in Washington, there's been a disconnect regarding how to go about marketing those wars without the consent of Congress and through executive orders. Now, with that being said, and you rightly pointing out, that the United States blueprint still stays in the region, and it will, because the U.S. has over 800 bases across the world in different countries outside of its own territory, especially in South China Sea, concerning Pakistan because it's China there, and now in Pakistan as well. But like you said, going forward, Pakistan will need to be very careful as to not create more enemies or not create new enemies as it starts creating more friends. There was something very interesting and very significant that happened earlier this year when the Pakistan's foreign minister, Shah Mahmood Qureshi, stood next to Russian foreign minister and said that Pakistan's ties with Russia are now a priority, something very significant coming out of Pakistan's top diplomat, knowing that Russia was seen as a major enemy.
I'm going to have to interject, Moyed, because we are bang out of time, and I'd like to just thank my panel once again for their participation. Lieutenant General retired Naeem Khalid Lodi, Asif Durrani, former ambassador, and of course, Moyed, apologies for interjecting, Moyed Jafri joining us from Lahore. 20 years of pain, sorrow, many questions being asked on this side of the world, many questions being asked on the other side of the Atlantic. As the Americans mark their dead, of course, many on this side of the world will be marking the victory as seen by the Afghan Taliban. But in essence, what we all must be wary of is the wolf in sheep's clothing. That's a wrap for today and this week. I'll see you same time, same place on Monday. Look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much for watching.